Tirez encore une carte. Il faut réfléchir, il faut voir.
Pour voir ça, merci.
Vous vous trompez. Cette carte n'est pas forcément la mort. Les pieds et les mains sont couverts de chair. C'est une transformation profonde de tout votre être.
Assez, taisez-vous. Depuis 2 jours, je le sais. Dès qu'on m'a fait un prélèvement, j'ai compris. Je n'ai pas besoin d'attendre de résultat. Et dans ma main?
En main, je n'y connais rien. Je ne sais pas.
C'est donc si grave?
Hello, welcome back to the Neon Eye Curation podcast. I'm back here with Catherine and Caitlin again, and Callum. We last talked about Gone Girl, so we're developing some of those ideas today when we talk about Cléo from 5 to 7 by Agnes Varda. So just to start off, do you want to give us a little bit of the context behind the film? What's Agnes Varda going for here?
Okay, so in the 1960s, the women's lib movement started to emerge, and female filmmakers such as Agnes Varda were breaking through into a world that had been dominated primarily by men, particularly in the Hollywood studio system. In France, a particularly niche and exciting group of young people, the Nouvelle Vague, which was made of Jean-Luc Godard, François Truffaut and Agnes Varda, began making films that challenged traditional Hollywood techniques. These Hollywood techniques, as we spoke about in Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema by Laura Mulvey, promoted a male gaze. And Varda really, with Cléo from 5 to 7, turned this on its head. And I think maybe that's where we begin.
Yeah, it's a good beginning. So, I suppose maybe just to recap, what are we've looked at a range of films going all the way back to Gilda, but what is the male gaze as a recap, and what is Varda sort of responding to?
Okay, so the male gaze was a way of using the camera that suspended a woman as a passive object in a film and a man as an active viewer who would drive the narrative. And Agnes Varda uses a really beautiful technique with her camera, which Phil Powery has described as a nomadic gaze. And for Powery, this nomadic gaze, which is a term taken from the philosopher Rosie Braidotti, is about transformation, transition, and continual change, rather than unity and linearity. So rather than using a male gaze that would want to interrogate and get to a final solution, Varda wanders through the changing identity of a woman who, having learnt that she could die of cancer, starts to reevaluate how she lives her life. And all the way through to the end of the film, we're never given an answer, because the film is constantly about this becoming and this change.
Okay, so Varda is taking the idea of this male gaze and trying to, I suppose, just in the scheme of where we're at in this curation and just in cinema, she's sort of trying to offer an alternative. Would that be a good way to say it?
Yeah, I think that's the perfect way to put it. And she allows women to not be an object who's looked at, to an object who can look, who has agency. And you see that really clearly in Cléo from 5 to 7, at Cléo's transition. So in the beginning of the film, she calls herself a doll. And, she says being ugly is a kind of death. Everything is about her image and her facade. She makes herself to be looked at. And once she sings Sans Toi, that kind of fantastically awful song in which she realises she's singing, Seule, laide et vide, so alone, ugly and pallid without you.
Toutes portes ouvertes, en plein courant d'air.
She starts to realise that she's just living an image that someone else has given her, and that she doesn't have to embody it.
Sans toi.
And as Cléo starts singing, Varda pans in so seamlessly that you don't even notice the camera's moving, and the camera itself travels and is, constantly changing. And in traditional Hollywood cinema, you'd expect a cut, to what Laura Mulvey would call a narrative no man's land, you know, a close-up of Cleo singing, a tear running down her face, soft lighting, but instead we see how that, we see all the space in between, how that shot is created, and I think that for me is why it's more relatable.
Je suis un corps vide, sans toi, sans toi.
To talk about interior and exterior, so what are you getting at with that, I suppose?
So I suppose in that sans toi scene, when she's singing, it's really clear because you see Cleo placed in her environment, but and it's in her apartment, but it's almost like a fairy tale dream. It's bright white, it's got a really soft glow from the lighting, the balustrades of the beds are like vine leaves. She's got a rope swing in her apartment, and behind the rope swing, when she sits on it, there's a pair of angel wings, you know? This is a complete fairy tale, and she wears it and believes it to be herself, you know? She thinks that being ugly is a kind of death. She's completely bought into being the fairy tale princess who will be saved by her ironically named lover, Jose, you know, the kind of Latin lover in traditional Hollywood movies, Prince Charming. And so, in that sense, her exterior space and all of the exterior expectations placed upon her by her entourage become her interior reality. But when we get that pan that moves in to a close-up of her face, we start to realise that she's a psychological being, there's more to her. She's crying, you know, and it's not just the capricious enfant, as her lover calls her. It's the fact that she, it's all been a performance up until now, and it hasn't been her own self.
Seule, laide et livide, sans toi, sans toi, sans toi.
C'est trop. Je ne peux plus.
Do you think that moment is a kind of realisation then?
Totally. It's, I mean, colour-wise in the film, it's really clear. You go from the beginning when Cleo is frequently dressed in white, and then at this moment you have the black backdrop, this kind of Wagnerian strings, and the melodrama, and suddenly she takes off her fake wig, she puts on a black dress, and it's almost like she's walking into death, only it's not the death of her body, as you might expect. She's got cancer. It's the death of who she used to be, and it's the kind of beginning of her transition. And just a kind of side note, that is mimicked in that small, fun film with Godard in, which also has the black and white transition, and the glasses, which is all about looking. So, you know, quite mise en abîme.
Yeah, that's clever.
That kind of Brechtian edge that Varda has, you know. She alienates Savure a bit, which we see again in Jean Dielman and in Daisies by Vera Chitlova. All of these women were using kind of jarring cinematic techniques that made us aware that we were looking. So we weren't just being seduced into a particular gaze, we were being asked to question how we look. And just, you know, in Cleo as well, right at the beginning when she's walking down the stairs, having, you know, received the death card in her reading. What would you call that? It's not palmistry.
Tarot, is it?
That's it, yeah. And as she's walking down the stairs, Varda uses a jump cut and shows Cleo stepping 4 times in time with the music. That whole moment you go, oh, hang on a minute, what should be the truth, you know, it's black and white, it's a very fluid camera, all of the techniques that would be used in documentary filmmaking, but it's all broken because suddenly we realise that it's constructed and it's tampered with, and so we go, hang on a minute, we've got to question everything we think is true in this movie. you really start to see from the point of view shots that Varda uses as well that Cleo becomes aware of death in the world. There's the man who's shot in Le Dôme, the cafe, and then suddenly you see Cleo standing behind the target that's been made by the bullet hole. Death is heading her way. You see children on horses, potentially their freedom, their future, but moving nowhere because they're in a playground. So you get this sense of a kind of cyclical and slightly melancholic nature to life. But there's a real beauty in it, because it's the first time that she finds potentially love, or at least some sort of peace with herself.
Do you think it's supposed to be a point of like transformation, or a point of, well, not even, it's just because I was reading earlier, somebody says that they don't see it as Cleo transforming in that stage, but it's just supposed to be a development of her sort of as a person and as a woman, which you don't often get with the previously in films, the women in films. But it's I was just thinking back to, it's not her becoming someone new. I was thinking back to Vertigo, where she's the two women and she's sort of like changing herself, but she's still the same person, but that's not as clear in Vertigo. But in this, I think it's more her developing as a person rather than a specific point of transformation. I'm not sure I've explained that clearly. I couldn't really remember the exact point that was made.
Yeah,
But
I think it's really interesting as a point, and I think that's why the term nomadic is so beautiful, because the nomad is a traveller, and so it's not the kind of Freudian looking for your unity, your one self. You're not trying to find yourself. In Cleo, you're constantly becoming who you are, to use the words of Nietzsche, and you don't know what that's going to be. And so I think, you're right, it's not just black and white as, the film makes it. But I think for Varda it was important to have quite a clear message, because this is one of the first films that posits this from a female director that gets received at Cannes. And sometimes the first people to walk out with the flag need to be bold. And I think there's a bit of that.
So do you think Varda kind of set her? Are we still seeing this? Did we see it after this film? The idea of a nomadic gaze?
Totally. I think you see it prior to Varda in films by people like Leni Riefenstahl, and I know she's got a really difficult Nazi relationship, but her use of camera is fascinating because she also uses these long, still, poetic pans, and it's about the lingering, it's about paying attention to what time looks like. And you get the same thing in Jean Dillman by Chantal Akerman, where the camera rests for 7 minutes at the end on Jean with a flashing light. So I think you're completely right. It was maybe a peak, but it had been bubbling and still does.
That's interesting. And how did it? Because obviously Varda is, in a sense, she's kind of part of the French New Wave movement. So how does it compare to the likes of Truffaut and Godard, the work that she's doing here in terms of subverting the gaze?
I think in terms of the pace of the movie, it's a lot slower. It really is about just the turning of the page. She splits Cleo into chapters, and that happens really elegantly, She slips into another chapter. There's never, I don't think there's very often a cut, the word like chapter 2 or 3 just comes up on screen, and you realise that you're just stepping into it without having to have a splice. Whereas in Masculin Féminin, for example, by Godard, you've got these really quick, energetic cuts and lots and lots of jump cuts that kind of bump you along, and they're really exciting, but they take a different sort of pace. And Truffaut kind of, for me, sits in the middle of the two. He's got a really, really poetic touch, and he's got this real interest, particularly in the 400 Blows with children. I think a child's called Antoine. And there's a kind of slowness to that, especially the last shot on the beach, or the running shot as he runs to the beach, where you again see that camera pan, and it's a kind of, it's a slower, more psychological, reflective movement. What I think maybe is interesting, just kind of terminology-wise, is to think about the idea of the camera stylo that the New Wave used, and for them, the camera was like a pen. They were the auteur. They could write their own style. It was very autobiographic. That's the other thing. The New Wave of making autobiographic films. And for Varda, a huge part of her life is being a woman, and being subjected to a male gaze or an industry that doesn't accept women into it, and kind of breaking in. And in that sense, her films are very autobiographical, but the writing that she's doing with her camera is, I think, what I would call an écriture féminine, a feminine writing, because she has a very fluid, handheld use of the camera, the very movement of which is nomadic. As we said with the chapters, it just slips between, or the scene when Cléo is trying on hats and Varda's filming from outside, and then you seem to move through the glass and then back out again, but all the camera's done is move in a straight line. And so for me, there's it's almost like a dancerly approach that she has, and she's constantly therefore crossing boundaries because she's not relying on a splice to do this all the time. And so so that would be the only thing really, just that the écriture féminine is a key theme that we're going to see again, particularly in Jean Dielman. And so just to kind of outline that Varda has a really personal écriture féminine. There's no one feminine writing. It's there are multiple feminine writings, and that's the whole point. That's the whole point of Cléo from 5 to 7. We don't need to have one ending. We don't know whether she'll die, whether she'll get married, whether she's in love, whether she's not. But we know that she's got a potential and the chance to become something that she never would have been had she remained in her fairy tale land.
I suppose just to sort of wrap up, how was Varda, because Varda passed away recently, didn't she? How was she received at the time, and what sort of legacy has Cléo had, do you think?
Her film was great. They loved it. It was in the Cannes Film Festival. I think in the same year as last year in Marienbad, another New Wave film was made by Alain Resnais, which was rejected because he, I think, signed a petition against the Algerian War. So, you've got that, which is another really interesting film. And, she's on an equal footing to that, I think. And I think that says a lot in terms of the industry. And of course, when she died, I was in France studying, and I was living on the road parallel to where she lived. So, and they renamed the street Rue Agnes Varda. So there's that beautiful moment in Cléo when they're driving out, Dorothy and Cléo in the car, and they go, all the names of these streets are so ridiculous. Rue Arrivée, Rue Départ. And so in France, there was a huge thing about renaming the road for her. So really fondly remembered.
Oh, that's great.
Tu sais, autour de la gare, ils se sont pas cassés pour les noms. Rue du départ, rue de l'arrivée. Mets ton bras, on retourne.
Thank you for watching this episode of Cléo from 5 to 7. For Catherine's articles about the film and all the ones we've done so far in this series, including Cléo, and next week's one, Jean Dielman, go on our website, neoneye.co.uk, and we'll be talking about that next week. Thank you for listening. Thank you.